Okay, welcome back. Let's take a look at what are the steps involved in configuring the vSphere Trust Authority. We just gave an outline of all the main steps that you have to perform, right? You'll need to export properties from the cluster to be trusted. You then enable the services on the Trust Authority cluster and import the identities onto the Trust Authority cluster. Configure the KMS services, and then you'll need to export the identities off of the hosts in that Trust Authority cluster so you can import them back onto the hosts to be trusted, right? This requires two separate vCenter servers. The vCenter server that is managing all of your traditional compute workloads, that might be one vCenter. It might actually be multiple vCenters, but you have to have a dedicated vCenter for the VTA, right? For the actual Trust Authority cluster, it needs its own vCenter. So remember, we have our blue Trust Authority cluster needs its own vCenter server, and our green cluster is going to have its own vCenter, or however many attested clusters you might have. Now, they might be in their own separate single sign-on domains, but they could also be in their own single sign-on domain, meaning that you're in enhanced link mode. So both methods are definitely supported. In fact, this enhanced link mode makes a lot of sense because then you can set up that global permission for that Trust Authority administrator that needs to be able to log into all the vCenter servers, right? The blue vCenter would only have the Trust Authority admin, whereas the green cluster, the Trust Authority admin would just be one of however many roles you need in that environment. What you can't do, though, is put all of this under a single vCenter. That is not supported. So don't do that. We made sure nice and big, nice big red, can't do this, right? That is not a supported configuration. You need two separate vCenters, or at least two vCenters, right? Because you might have multiple vCenters that the VTA cluster is actually attesting hosts with. So that's the first thing, right? Another thing, it's not in the vSphere client to configure this, not just yet. The enabling the entire process, the entire configuration, everything is done over Power CLI. So this is the first release of vSphere 7, right? And in this release, it is utilizing Power CLI version 12, has a whole new set of Power CLI commandlets that are used to configure this whole process. Now, we're going to do this in the lab. It's actually pretty neat to see the whole thing come under this process and to actually complete and work, but it does involve a lot of steps. The good news is we've actually preserved all of the commands in a simple text file so that you don't even have to type them in. You can copy and paste. Sure, they're in the book, so if you want to know what the actual commands are, they're in the lab manual. But here, let me just quickly show you. I'm going to jump over to the lab environment here. All right, so here we are in the lab environment. In the lab environment, we are going to do a little bit of preparation first. So what do we mean by that? Well, here we happen to have a cluster called the Trust Authority cluster. That's actually not what it's going to be. This one host, host number 8, this is the host to be attested. So we're going to rename this, and you make sure you name it exactly as the lab manual tells you to name it. It's case sensitive and everything. But this is going to be the trusted cluster. Over here under the other vCenter server that we have in the lab environment, this cluster, you're going to rename this one. This is the cluster that is the VTA. That's the cluster that's going to do the attesting. This is the cluster that's going to be connected to the KMS. Even though it is only running one host, that's not how you're supposed to do this. It's supposed to be a 3-node cluster. But in any case, that's our training lab. So this is going to be the VTA. That's going to be in Site B. And then the cluster to be trusted is the one that's going to be in Site A. Just important to remember that, right? So this, to kind of go back to our slides, this is the blue cluster, and this is the green cluster, right? That probably makes it even make more sense, right? So we have this all lined up in a text file for us. That makes this so much easier. I think it's here. Yep. So what do we have here, right? This is a file. It's called vta.txt, right? This has got all the lab steps nicely outlined for us, so we don't have to actually type any of it in. In fact, you can be really super lazy, not telling you to do this, but you can basically copy, well, you want the whole thing in here, right? You get the whole thing, and you can actually just copy and then paste it right into a PowerShell console. But just taking a look at what the commands are, right? The first thing we're going to do is export the TPM certificates and ESXi image metadata. So we know what version of vSphere, for instance, from the host to be attested, right? This is the host that is going to be trusted. This is host number 8 on site A, because that's the one we're going to rename, because I know right now it says it's actually the VTA, but this is the one we're going to rename, and you're going to basically export out this information, right? Now I have to actually put on my glasses to see all this, but nonetheless, we will export out the TPM certificate, the host image database information. These are new Power CLI commands that we have available. Then we're going to export the trusted user principals from the vCenter server that's to be trusted, right? So again, we need to be able to log into all these systems as the trusted admin. We have a special account. We're actually setting this up in one of the labs to make sure we actually have the trusted admin role, and we're going to assign it to a user called trusted admin. So now we've exported everything from site A, the site to be trusted. Now over here, we're going to enable the trust authority services. This is going to be the blue cluster. This is the one that's going to be on the site B. That's actually the name of the cluster we want you to create. It's going to be, or you're going to rename the one that's actually called SB cluster. You're going to call it SB VTA cluster 01. And we're going to set the cluster attributes to make this a trust authority cluster. We'll then import the trusted host information that we gathered from the export over here, and we're going to import that into the site B set of systems. Right, so again, we're going into the site B vCenter server, and we'll basically import them with these new commands. Then we're going to create a trusted key provider, right? Because now that you've actually got both the, well, no, not both, but we've actually exported the information from the cluster to be trusted, and we've imported that information into the actual trusted cluster. We still need to have a key server. So we need to create a KMS association. There are a whole set of commands to set a trusted key provider. We're doing this actually at the vCenter level, which will do this across the cluster for us. Then we export the Trust Authority cluster settings with the export Trust Authority services info, and then finally import the Trust Authority. So we're finding the information about the VTA, so we can now import this into the trusted host cluster, which is the SA trusted cluster, the one that is the one holding host 8. And that's basically what we need to do here. This sets up the entire configuration. And like I said, don't copy and paste the whole thing, because you don't want to copy and paste all this stuff. What you need to do is basically copy and paste each of the different little paragraphs, and it will actually take care of it for you. And it actually works without having to worry about typos. And then what you'll do is you'll end up encrypting a VM using this trusted computing mechanism in order to do that. Right? So we need these Power CLI scripts, and then you can encrypt a VM in the normal way, right? You actually give the VM an encryption policy, because the host that you're applying this to is a trusted host under a trusted authority attestation, so it's part of a root of trust. Then this VM will get its key to encrypt the VM from the KMS through the VTA cluster. It will not get the key from a KMS that might be associated with the vCenter server that's managing that cluster. Right? The whole point of this is you're going to get your keys from the actual VTA cluster. Because you can mix trusted key providers and standard key providers. I'm not too sure why would people want to make that complexity. I mean, basically, once you've got this mechanism in place, you've got this ability to build VM encryption in a trusted scenario, will then have all of your key handoffs through the VTA cluster and not through a vCenter, because now you can actually encrypt that vCenter server, which you couldn't do with the standard key provider. So, other things to note when you do encrypt a VM using this trusted mechanism, it looks a lot like any other VM that's been encrypted. It's actually pretty hard to tell. If you look at this screen capture, this is a VM that's been encrypted with a trusted key provider. And how do I know that? Well, we've highlighted it for you, right? But there's the icon with a little padlock to tell you, oh, it's been secured, it's been encrypted, and then it says right there in the fine print, encrypted with trusted key provider. If you're familiar with VM encryption, it is actually really, really similar to a standard key provider. In fact, here's how they actually look side by side. A trusted encrypted, or a VM encrypted with a trusted key provider, has that little green check. Whereas over here, a VM that's encrypted with a standard key provider just has the good old padlock. So you can't really tell very quickly, I find, whether or not the VM has been encrypted one way or the other. Remember, if you're in a trusted cluster, this is how the VM will be encrypted anyway. If you encrypt a VM on a cluster that is not part of a trust authority trusted cluster, then the VM will be encrypted with the traditional method, provided you actually have a traditional key provider in the first place. Now, interesting things here too, those VMs that have been encrypted with the trusted key provider, these VMs can only run on ESX servers that have been trusted through this VTA trust mechanism. They cannot run on non-trusted hosts. These VMs that have been encrypted with standard encryption, they can run anywhere. They're not restricted. They can run on any host in any cluster. But these VMs are limited on where they can run, which is important because if somehow a host that was part of that trust authority cluster, the trusted host cluster, if any of those hosts have failed their trusted attestation, then the VM just can't run there, right? So if someone has actually manipulated anything on those hosts, well, these trusted VMs that have much higher security settings can't run on those hosts that failed their attestation. That's important, right? So a VM that's been set with a trusted key provider, that's this VM with the gold padlock, can only run on an attested cluster. It will be prevented from running on any other sort of standard cluster. In fact, if you try, you'll get this error message saying that a general runtime error has occurred. You can't do this because the cluster that you're moving, the trusted VM, is not a trusted cluster. So, like I said, you're going to do 3 labs here. Lab number 10, you're going to essentially set up the environment for this, right? Like I said, you're going to need to rename some things around, right? So actually, I take that back. Lab 10, all you're doing here is you're setting up a user permission on both vCenter servers. That's what you're going to do first, right? So you're going to set up the Trust Authority admin role and have a user get assigned that role. Then we're going to assign this user called Trusted Admin with the role of Trusted Authority admin. In Lab 11, the very first thing you're going to do is rename things. You're going to rename the cluster in Site B. That's going to be the VTA cluster. And then the cluster in Site A is going to become the host attested or the host trusted cluster. And then you'll have all the different PowerCLI scripts to set up the Trust Authority cluster. And then finally, in Lab 12, we'll have you encrypt a VM with the trusted key provider. And you'll see how easy that is, right? So basically what this has done, though, it's made the system a far more secure environment where the people who are actually setting up this encryption in the VMs, it isn't that complicated. Sure, setting up that initial Trust Authority cluster seems somewhat complex, mostly just because of all the PowerCLI scripts. But once that's been set up, you now have that defined Trust Authority cluster, which can now remotely attest all the hosts that have TPM chips and are booting securely so that only those trusted VMs can run on those trusted hosts. So before you go off and do the lab, just remember, here we have the lab instructions, right? We've mentioned this, the Trust Authority Administrator. Here we actually break down the tasks of what you're doing in Lab 11, right? If you notice the vta.txt file that I was just talking about, that starts with task 2. Export the TPM certificate and the ESXi metadata. Task 1, you're basically renaming your clusters. And then in Lab 12, we'll have you encrypt a VM using the trusted key provider that we had enabled in the PowerCLI scripts. And then finally, yes, what did we do? We've gone through this VTA lesson, which actually offers a pretty cool overview of a very powerful new feature, really the next step in securing a vSphere environment using the vSphere Trust Authority. So we described it, we took a look at the use cases for it, and explained the general architecture of the vSphere Trust Authority, and now we've actually completed a lab building the VTA. So go ahead and do those 3 labs, try out building your VM, encrypting it using the trusted key provider, and we'll see you in the next lesson.